Hey there, and welcome back to another DreamWorks video. And today, I want to talk a little bit about DreamWorks and their uncanny ability to churn out sequels that either improve upon, or just outright eclipse the original film upon which they've been based. And I mean, obviously there are exceptions to this rule. Shrek the Third does come to mind, but more on that later. But for the most part, it does seem like DreamWorks is always able to improve upon their initial films in a way that many studios can't. Just look at films from the majority of studios, not even animation studios, just studios in general. And I think people would agree that in a franchise, it's often the first film that's considered the best, the most prestigious of the set, the one with the best character development, the best narrative flow, critical score. Hell, the only thing they usually don't have is the highest box office total. And that's because the sequels often skate off their success, and thus they have a bigger pool to draw their audience from that want to come and see it. And don't get me wrong, Pixar's able to churn out better sequels too from time to time, as can a number of other studios, or films in a direct franchise like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. But rarely is a company so consistent in their ability to take what is often a mediocre film at times, and make a sequel that often improves upon it in every way, or at the very least, maintains that quality, and just keeps things consistently good. And whenever there is a DreamWorks franchise, you can always guarantee that first sequel follows this trend. And so, I guess there's nothing more to do than to run through some examples of exactly what I mean. And we'll start with Shrek. So yes, Shrek. It's a banger film, a game changer, one of the all-time animated classics. It did everything right. It had great character work, great action, story, songs, and really blazed a trail for a whole new genre of animated parody films, and kicked off DreamWorks' brief golden age in the early 2000s. It is pretty hard to top that, all things considered. The only thing it was really missing is the massive box office gross that we associate with the Shrek franchise. Not saying it bombed or anything, but like I said, at the time it was a relative unknown. It didn't have that same pre-built audience that the later films would have. And because of that, its overall gross isn't as impressive as I think it would have been if people would have been able to predict how awesome it was going to be. But it still did really well. Over $400 million for a first installment is nothing to sniff at. And it also got an 88% on Rotten Tomatoes. A very good showing. But then that posed a problem. How do you top this film? Yeah, the box office will just grow and grow, but it seems like a bit of a tall order to try and maintain the actual qualities within the films themselves. And yet, this is exactly what they did. Shrek 2 was released in 2004 to both critical and commercial acclaim. It grossed $928 million, eclipsing the first film by a significant margin, whilst largely maintaining that overall quality of the film itself, cramming the same charm, humour, character development, and overall narrative strength into a sequel that managed to slightly edge out the first with its Rotten Tomatoes score, 89% fresh. Not too shabby, all things considered. And so they were riding high. Nothing can stop them now. Their first major sequel had changed the game. Now they could milk franchises willy-nilly. But better yet, they could milk these franchises while still earning fan goodwill by producing good quality cinematic experiences, until they immediately embarrassed themselves with Shrek the Third. And Shrek the Third is a truly awful film. And you might say that already they'd proven that they can't possibly be the king of sequels, that they can't claim that title now they've released this festering turd. But don't forget, they then followed this up with Shrek Forever After, which isn't great compared to Shrek 1 and 2, but it's certainly better than the third one, and if you want to argue semantics, you could say Shrek Forever After is a sequel to Shrek the Third, and therefore, the rule still works. So really, I think it evens things out. But even without that stretch, every rule needs an exception. And next up, I want to talk through the Madagascar trilogy. Now, as a kid, I loved Madagascar, and honestly, even now as an adult, I personally still think it really holds up well. Is it the greatest film in the world? No, it's not. And honestly, I don't think it even comes close to being the best film in DreamWorks' library. But I still love it. But more importantly, I understand that a lot of people don't love it. They don't rate it very highly at all. After all, it only has a critical score of 55% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's clearly not considered one of the classics, and that's okay, that's fair enough. And so you'd expect that would just be the end of the franchise, right? Well, wrong, because it did well at the box office, grossing over $500 million, which means that the studio got a chance at a sequel. And really, not much change from the first film to the second. The character development, the humour, all of that largely remained the same. But what did change? The story, the way it was written, the way it played out. The writing itself was just a little bit better, and it bumped it up to 64% on Rotten Tomatoes. And of course, the box office returns remained lucrative. And so they made a third film, and they continued to perfect the formula, improve upon the story, and they bumped itself up to 78%, with a gross of over $700 million. And so, whilst these aren't life-changing films by any means, they continue to conform to that general trend, that the longer time period DreamWorks gets to work with a franchise, the better and more successful the films become. And once again, we can see this with another monster franchise. Seriously, DreamWorks just churns these things out. Because of course, I'm talking about Kung Fu Panda. What a glorious franchise that is. It's some of the best world building that DreamWorks has ever done. Great humor, great design, a great story, epic and exciting character arcs and development, exciting and fast-paced action. It has heart, has drama, angst, a great message. Literally anything you'd want from animated entertainment. This first film has it all. And it even got a sizable gross of over $600 million at the box office, and a Rotten Tomatoes score of 87%. Not too shabby. But once again, we see this, and you can't help but think, how the hell do you top that? Or at the very least, how do you keep up that consistent quality? And yet once again, they managed to do just that with the release of Kung Fu Panda 2, which was yet another commercial success, but also maintained a fairly high standard in terms of its quality. It has an 80% on Rotten Tomatoes. And whilst it probably isn't quite as good as the original, it was still a massive triumph and continued to deliver great character development, story progression, action, really anything you'd want from a Kung Fu Panda film. And then they pulled off the rare hat trick with the release of Kung Fu Panda 3, which, yeah, this one is my least favourite, but I can still recognise that once again, they managed to maintain that really high quality of filmmaking. It's a very good threequel, and it got an 86% on Rotten Tomatoes to boot. It did fairly well at the box office, although by this point we were starting to see some diminishing returns on that. But I don't think that lesser gross really diminishes the legacy of the franchise as a whole. And the fact that DreamWorks was still able to release 3 franchise films in a row without them becoming utter dog shit, or starting out as utter dog shit, as in the case of Shrek or Madagascar, is really impressive. Because Kung Fu Panda starts off high tier, it continues to be high tier, and then it ends high tier. And this really just further cements DreamWorks' legacy as the master of sequels. But does their story end here? No, indeed it does not, because this company is seemingly unable to stop doing this. They do it again and again and again. How to Train Your Dragon, yet another example. It's a trilogy of films released by DreamWorks, and honestly that's always a risk. And yet each of them did fairly decently at the box office, and most importantly, each of them were able to maintain that relatively high quality. And so whilst the critical scores do dip the further along in the franchise you go, they don't dip by that much. After all, each of the films is able to keep above the 90% approval rating mark. How many trilogies are able to boast that? So to put it simply, these movies are goddamn good. They combine great visual designs with really stellar world building, exciting character arcs, an epic soundtrack, and hell, dragons! Come on, dragons! What's not to love? And then we can even come to a few series that I haven't really seen before. The Croods, Boss Baby, Trolls. Well, I've seen Boss Baby. You can watch my rant against that abomination, that crime against humanity, right here. But anyway, apparently the sequel to that film is worse. Whew! And I don't even want to know how that's possible, but yes. This is the first true blemish in DreamWorks' grand dynasty of sequels since the release of Shrek the Third. I've not seen it, but The Croods apparently maintained a decently high standard across the first 2 films and even had a better score for the sequel, whilst Trolls and Trolls World Tour are largely consistent in terms of quality, with the sequel perhaps being a little bit worse, but it's mostly negligible. And so yeah, I really do have to say that DreamWorks have managed to hone the creation of sequels into a fine art form. Many of their standalone films, well, they aren't always of the highest quality. But if there's one thing I know from my years watching this studio produce films, it's that when they decide to make a follow-up or a sequel, it's almost always on par with the original, and sometimes will even be better. It's almost always guaranteed to be good. And in only a few instances have they ever taken a good franchise and ruined it with a dogshit sequel. So when it comes to making good and profitable franchises that they can milk for everything they're worth, there are few that even come close to matching DreamWorks for their sheer consistency. But yeah, that's the end of the video. And I would like to say that these were just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the video? Do you agree with my thoughts on DreamWorks, or maybe you don't? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.